Hey, estate planning attorney Paul Rabelais here, and in this video, we're going to talk about estate legal matters that need to be addressed by a surviving spouse within a relatively short period of time after their spouse dies. So sometimes surviving spouses just assume they don't need to do anything after their spouse dies. So I want to address kind of typical matters that really should be addressed after your spouse dies. Now, I'll be the first to admit this is kind of a tough video for me to make because everybody's circumstances can be so different, but I'm going to do my best. Okay, so really immediately after your spouse dies, again, generally the first thing that needs to be addressed, and this doesn't have anything to do, or not much to do with estate legal matters, but certainly all those funeral arrangements, family have to be dealt with. All of that stuff is typically dealt with, within that maybe 7 to 10 day period after your spouse dies. So that's enough to deal with. Focus on that. Now, I will say if there's some pressing estate legal matter that's bothering you in those first few days after your spouse dies, by all means, make the call, address it, get the advice, do what you need to do. But I would say, those first 7 to 10 days can be a traumatic time for surviving spouses. So just take care of you, take care of family, take care of funeral arrangements. But once that gets behind you, I really wouldn't wait too long to start addressing some of these things for the reasons that I'm about to tell you. And I will say, by the way, when you're handling those funeral arrangements, you're likely to be asked, would you like some death certificates? How many would you like to get? And I would say, because they're relatively inexpensive, get more than you think you need. You'll need perhaps one for each financial institution where you or your spouse had accounts. Maybe, ask for a few more. Most people get maybe 10 or 15 death certificates. That's common. All right, so now that piece is behind you, you want to start looking at some of these estate legal matters. One of the first things that you want to do is determine if a probate is necessary, or as we call it here in Louisiana, determine whether a succession is necessary. And you can go ahead and kind of initiate that determination because you don't need death certificates to initiate a succession proceeding. Death certificates don't get filed at the courthouse right out of the box. Instead, family members sign these affidavits. That's proof to the court that the person passed away and what their family circumstances were. So, you want to take a look at the real estate that the deceased spouse owned. If, especially here in Louisiana, if you purchased a home with your spouse while you and your spouse were alive, and now that your spouse has passed away, and that property is in both of your names, there's going to be a probate necessary to get his name off of the title. You're not going to be able to sell that home or that real estate that he owned until you've addressed the probate. Take a look at the financial accounts. Many married couples have joint bank accounts, and in many cases, if one spouse dies, the survivor can still transact that joint bank account. But determine whether your deceased spouse had accounts that were solely in his or her name. Look and see if your deceased spouse had any individual brokerage accounts, or whether the two of you had some joint brokerage accounts. Again, your deceased spouse's interest in those brokerage accounts will likely be frozen, and the probate will be necessary. Those court orders will be necessary to order those brokerage firms to retitle the account from your deceased spouse's name into your name or into the appropriate heir's name. So take a look at that. I realize some other states you can title brokerage accounts, things like joint tenants with rights of survivorship, where the accounts automatically go to the surviving spouse. And so, but that option is not allowed here in Louisiana. So take a look at that. Take a look at your car titles or registration. Again, some surviving spouses mistakenly tell me, Paul, I'm okay. All our vehicles are in both of our names. I'm good. Well, you're not good, because in order to sell or trade in or transfer that vehicle, both you and your deceased spouse's signatures would be necessary. So you're not okay. Again, you got to go through the probate stuff to get your deceased spouse's name off of that car title and get that car into your name only or into the names of the heirs, whatever the case may be. So that's the kind of determination that you need to make about whether there's a probate, or as we call it in Louisiana, a succession that's necessary. So make that determination. And then once you know the answer, you can take the appropriate action. Now that you've done that, now the death certificates ought to be rolling in. So now it's time to address some of the things that do require death certificates. So you'll want to deal with your deceased spouse's beneficiary designation items, things like annuities that were owned by your spouse, life insurance, IRAs, and other retirement accounts. And I would say it is really important to address those really as soon as practical after your spouse dies, because if you don't take care of that and put those beneficiary designation assets like IRAs in your name, if you don't go to the financial institution right away, present the death certificate, and do the paperwork that you need to do to get those assets that are in your name if you were designated as the beneficiary, and if you don't do that before you pass away, then it will create significant both probate and income tax problems for your heirs if you pass away before you've taken care of all of that stuff after your spouse died. So make sure you go ahead and address that. Now, maybe you don't want to make major investment and long-term, financial decisions immediately after your spouse dies, but at least get it in your name so you avoid all the income tax and probate problems that would exist if you pass away without those things being in your names. Okay, and then another issue to address is if you and your spouse created a living trust and all those trust assets, they bypass or they don't have to go through the judge, court, attorney involved probate proceeding. There may be no probate necessary. However, many joint trusts that married couples create require that upon the first death, those joint assets be split into the deceased spouse's trust and the surviving spouse's trust. And while you don't need any judges or lawyers or court orders to do that, because that surviving spouse is typically the trustee of that trust and they can do that themselves, it is important to go ahead and separate those assets for two reasons. One of the reasons that's important to go ahead and address that is for potential future estate tax consequences. Now, that doesn't affect everyone, but it can be really important to separate those assets, particularly if the couple has different heirs or beneficiaries. And you see that a lot when married couples get later in life and they each have their own heirs or beneficiaries. You want to make sure that those joint trust assets get split upon the first deaths so there's no confusion. When the surviving spouse dies, what's the first spouse to die's assets and what's the surviving spouse's assets? So real important to address that. Now, with all that being said, are you required to hire an estate attorney when your spouse dies? Perhaps not, particularly if there's no probate necessary. If you're going to have to go through a probate, you're going to have to hire an attorney to guide you through that. But if there's no probate necessary, then there's no requirement that you hire an attorney to get you through these issues. However, you may want to get some estate administration legal advice for two reasons. One, you want to make sure that your deceased spouse's assets wind up where they're supposed to wind up. And then two, you want to make sure that moving forward, your estate is set up properly so that you have the protections that you need, you have the control that you need, and you have things in place now to protect your future heirs or beneficiaries. So some final advice, I'd say number one, turn the gray like button to blue. That tells YouTube, hey, show Paul's videos to a few more folks. They might like to see it. And then two, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you don't miss anything as I keep making these really incredible estate planning videos so that more people get educated. But three, I'd say don't be afraid to ask questions. So there is no stupid question. I've been doing this for 30 years, and as I look back and think back for 30 years, if somebody asked me, Paul, what's the stupidest question anybody ever asked you? I can't even think of one, because if it's something that bothers you or concerns you, it's an important question. Even though it may be a very easy question for somebody like me to answer, if it's causing you some stress, it's a great question. Then two, I'd say, or number four, whatever, if you get help, get the right help. Maybe you don't want the person at the bank who's now trying to sell you an annuity because your husband left some CDs at the bank. Maybe he's not the right person, or she's not the right person to get you through some of these just initial estate administration concerns. And while you may not want to make any major, financial and contractual decisions immediately, some people say, I'm not going to do anything major for a year. I lost my spouse. I don't want to make any difficult decisions. I'm not going to make any decisions for a year. I would say, however, that it is prudent to handle the things that I discussed in this video. It is prudent to kind of handle those really right away, or as soon as practical after your spouse passes away. So a tough issue, a tough time for surviving spouses. For many cases, they've lost their 30, 40, 50-year spouse. In many cases, it's their soulmate, their best friend, the person who handled all of the finances. For many surviving husbands and wives, they lost the person who just took care of all of this stuff. So I realize it can be overwhelming, but you're going to get through it. Everybody does. Get yourself some good help. Rely on people that you can trust, and things are going to be okay. All right, y'all take care. Have a great day. See ya.